I'd love to hear where you're coming from. Hello, Texas, my neighbor here. I'm a little bit outside of Austin myself. So, yeah, as we get started, by all means, share where you're from. I love this platform and the fact that we get to work with people all over the world. It's really awesome. So, anyhow, and happy Saturday, everyone. If Saturday's a thing for you, I know some people work Saturdays too. And thank you for joining something for your well being on a Saturday when you could be sleeping in, well, depending on what side of the world you're in. So, for the sake of time, I'm going to get started as I see where you guys are coming from. Yeah, Russia, Canada, Brooklyn. Hello. I just moved here from South Jersey. Not as cool as Brooklyn, but except no, I'm sorry. I loved everywhere I lived. Anyhow, just so you guys know, I'm a California native, a Colorado native-ish, and I've lived in New Jersey and now in Texas. So I've been in a lot of states in different parts of the U.S. as well. Scotland, Greece. Oh, awesome! So exciting. So, as we get started, I'm going to just briefly introduce myself. So, my full name is Munirah. I also go by Mooney because it's much easier. And I'm super excited. Again, this is only my third time running a group in our, and it's this group in our. And so, it's been really a positive experience. One thing I've learned is that how to manage like Q&A the best I can while making it through a lot of information I have here for you guys has been my balancing act I'm trying to work with. So what I learned is ideally I wanted to create some space at the end of this webinar for some really focused Q&A. My brain, it's hard for me to read three things at a time, so I do the best I can to see questions as they're coming in. What I learned is it's really hard to create that space at the end. So by all means, let questions come in as they come up for you. And if you could just excuse me if I miss it, I'm going to try my best to catch questions as they come in during the presentation. And then hopefully if we have time at the end, we can have some questions asked at that time as well. So a little bit about my background as well. I said where I'm from. Currently, I'm in Texas, and yeah, lived all over the states. Loved everywhere I've lived, and yeah, and I've also practiced counseling in all these different places as well. So I've been in the field of counseling, and hello from Kuwait. Yes, for gosh 20 plus years. And really, I think from the moment I was born, my earliest memories have to do with like what helps people heal. Like, so I don't know, it's just been a passion of mine from when I was very young. The things I would question, a lot to do with spirituality, healing, self-growth, that kind of stuff. So I'm just really passionate about what I do. So I feel really just lucky to be on this platform to share some of my places that I'm passionate about. So I also have on here my certification. So I'm licensed professional counselor. I'm also what's called a certified EFT practitioner. If anyone's heard of that, most people know of it as the tapping. Oh, is that the tapping? That's what I hear a lot. And yes, it is the tapping, which means it is a practice that I use in therapy with people, and it involves tapping on points of the body. It's from traditional. Thank you. It's from traditional Chinese medicine, and the idea is that these specific points in the body are associated with our emotional body, is what I call it. And so when it's used in session, something kind of magical happens, and I'm able to help people really access like hidden stores of trauma, and they're able to kind of work on the hidden patterns that these traumatic events and experiences have created in their systems. And we're going to talk today about how trauma does play a part in guilt and shame, of course, too. So I did want to share a little bit about that. I'm also certified in a fairly new type of yoga. It's called Buti yoga, B-U-T-I yoga. I'm newly certified in that, so I don't have too much knowledge about it yet, aside from what I've learned. In terms of putting in practice, I've used it on myself, which is why I've got certified in it. And it's also a form of body movement that I think really helps release trauma. So as you can imagine, based on my background, I'm very much someone of the holistic perspective. And in fact, I think that things have to be approached in a holistic way, because the human mind alone cannot access what impacts us. Your body stores so much of your memories and experiences. I can go on and on about that, but if you're curious about any of these things more, I've attached a handout I created about EFT to the start of this chat. You'll see the attachments, and it's kind of how I use it in sessions. And then, oh, that's a great idea. I would love actually to do a group in EFT. I didn't think about that. That is a great idea. So yeah, so really making sure that people are, tapping into all parts of who they are. And so my hope is that my background kind of says that, and what you'll learn in this group in R as well is that how to work with guilt and shame from that holistic perspective. So I hope this kind of comes through in this group in R, so you guys can think creatively about kind of what holistic would mean for you. How would you apply it to working with guilt and shame? So I have not heard the faster EFT model, but I will look into that. So moving right along, just to kind of dive in the presentation here, intentions. So I like to say intentions rather than goals for the sake of groups and some other things, because I like the idea of like this. My hope is that this isn't like, hey, check, I understand this, like marking off check boxes. I like to think of things as intentions. Like, here's what I hope you get out of this. You might have your own hopes and desires from this. You take what you will from this, and you can hopefully carry it forward in your life. I'm a personal believer in like we evolve until the day we die and beyond. And so for me, intentions is a way to invite the idea of like, we invite something into our intention and we let it flow through our lives day to day, rather than thinking we got something. Because if healing was that easy, it would happen overnight, right? So it's a part of the human experience. So I love that intention is deeper than a goal. That's a good way to put it. I'm having trouble describing more about it. So that's a beautiful way to put it. So intentions for today. So one, I hope we're going to be able to define guilt and shame and the differences between them. I have already looked into this. So kind of that basic level, what's the difference between them? And then really, I want to take the definition of guilt and shame a little bit deeper together, looking at it and understanding it, defining guilt and shame in a holistic way. So we'll talk more about that when we reach that part of the presentation here. And so deepening your awareness. I'm seeing that confusing me a lot. If you have a question you can ask that'll help me clarify, that would be great. So sorry if any of this is confusing. So the next part, intention here, is to deepen your awareness of how guilt and shame can develop and become a part of your daily experience. So this is going to be, I hope, really kind of opening for you guys when we reach this part here of like learning how guilt and shame develop. So they are things that really develop over time. I'm going to say from very young, very, very young. And so this is really important when you go in to heal it, because you can really get and validate probably how kind of deeply ingrained some experiences of deep guilt and shame can be. And then we're going to also look at the impact of it. So how it develops, and then how does it impact people? Also, how does it impact society? These kinds of things. And then we're going to start looking at some ways to look through your own experience of guilt and shame. Work through it. So my hope is that you do get some tools to start kind of working on your experience of guilt and shame. Personally, I think it's something that is best brought into some guided work with somebody. However, I think that there are some really good tools that I can hand over that I hope you can use to just heighten your awareness and start working on them at a certain level and have more clarity about where you want to go with the work. So those are our intentions for today, and moving right along into defining them. So I did go ahead and pull up the definitions from that typical Merriam-Webster online, because I like having that kind of surface definition. So what I did here is I put the definition from Merriam-Webster online of guilt and shame, and then I looked up definitions that have to do more with kind of the world of psychology. So let's go into this together. And as I go into this, I would love if you'd love to type in the chat box. Even sharing with your peers here is an awesome thing. I love the chat box feature here, because you're welcome to share your experiences, your own thoughts along the way, so that everyone in the group can just share too. So what I'd love to hear is if you have your own ideas of guilt and shame, you can share them there. Also, if you have ideas, we're going to talk about this, what you think the difference between guilt and shame is, feel free to start typing those. And there's no right or wrong here. So let's start with the definition of guilt. So Merriam-Webster online says that guilt is a feeling of deserving blame for offenses. Now, I pulled up a definition of guilt from it's like a psychology center in Australia. I just loved their definition of guilt here, so I pulled it from their site here. And they defined it as guilt is an emotional state where we experience conflict at having done something that we believe we should not have done. This part I think is important too. Or conversely, having not done something we believe we should have done. So this can give rise to a feeling state which does not go away easily and can be difficult to endure. And yes, I think Jo, you mentioned guilt is I've done a bad thing. Shame is I am a bad thing. I think that is a beautiful way to put it. So we'll get to that. So shame on Merriam-Webster Online is described as a painful emotion caused by consciousness of guilt, shortcoming, impropriety, a condition of humiliating disgrace or disrepute, something that brings censure or reproach, something to be regretted. Already you can see that shame has kind of a heartier definition. Actually, if you go on Merriam-Webster Online, there's like 7 things listed, something like that. And already from reading that definition, when I was putting this together, I immediately saw that kind of obvious influence of like there being almost like an external judge that becomes a part of shame. So when you think about things feeling disgraceful or humiliating, something being like bringing censure or feeling improper, it reminds me of like there's this kind of perceived judge of somebody, some society, whatever, telling us what's right from wrong. So we'll get into that a lot in this presentation here. So the next definition of shame I put here is from Brené Brown, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. She's awesome in the field, and I loved her definition of shame. She wrote down that shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. Like, what a beautifully painful definition here, because I think it really speaks to kind of how harmful shame can be, where it literally can leave us with feeling like disconnected or undeserving of love and connection. So big thing here, right? So yeah, this is a good awareness. So someone wrote here, almost 40 years, I thought my mom was a master of guilt to me, but I think it's actually shaming. So as we go through this presentation, many of you might have similar experiences of like, wait, I thought this was guilt, but this is shame. So I really hope as we go through this, you can kind of identify it more for yourself. And someone asked me in the last groupinar, like, you know, does guilt ever turn into shame? And I do think it's a blurry line sometimes. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. But I can say, for example, that guilt, yeah, and shame, some people naming that they feel it all the time, every day, right? Shame can be this really overarching feeling that we walk around with day to day. And someone put it beautifully earlier, the difference between guilt and shame. For me, there's many ways to put this, but I think the easiest go-to is that guilt is something we do. So there's an action or a behavior where we feel bad about it. Shame is that we internalize that and take it on as like, I'm a bad person. So let's see. So someone in the last group gave the example that they forgot their dad's birthday. So I'm going to use that one. So they forgot their dad's birthday and they felt guilty, right? Versus I forgot my dad's birthday and so I'm a really bad person. So does that make sense? So shame is applied to your whole being of who you are. You become bad to yourself or flawed in some way versus a behavior. So when you think about that, a lot of people, including in the field of psychology, talk about guilt is not always a bad thing. Shame almost always is toxic, right? So guilt doesn't necessarily need to be bad, because what people say is that, you know, if you feel guilt about something, it can make you change behavior, which makes sense, right? So the example of someone forgetting dad's birthday, they feel guilty. That visceral feeling probably sits with them, where next year they're going to remember their dad's birthday and probably do it better, right? So guilt sometimes can be productive, is the word we use. A lot of people kind of leave it at that and say that shame is the bad one, but I'm going to say that guilt can also be harmful. And a lot of my experience and what I'm going to say here comes from my work with a lot of people in my lifetime of being a counselor, and that guilt and shame shows up for everyone. And I have seen guilt really take a space in someone that becomes what I'm going to say toxic. And an example I have of here is that guilt, if it just keeps filtering through your system over and over and over again about something, I imagine that can be really tough really, really tough. And there's something there that it needs to be settled. And yes, guilt and manipulation can go hand in hand, someone wrote. And I think that's a good example here. If you're guilted, someone else gave the example earlier of feeling like they're constantly guilted by a parent figure. If you're constantly being guilted and it's in a form of some kind of manipulation, it can land on you in a way where it does bring a sense of shame, basically. Like, so walking around with guilt all the time about something can lead to shame, can feel the same as shame. So as we talk more about this, you might be able to tease that apart for yourself. But I work a lot with people who feel guilty about so many things that basically we can develop sometimes a guilt around like living the way we want to live. So I'm going to say that guilt can also be harmful depending on how it sits in you, how it expresses itself in your life. So take what you will from that, and as we talk more about it, hopefully it'll make sense. Why can I feel okay about something except around one person? That's a good point. So that can happen so often, and we're going to talk about environment and like family systems and support systems and things like that. And that's generally it. A lot of times is like, there's going to be certain people who have stated or unstated judgments or a way of living that might contrast with yours. This is one short thing of saying, but there's a lot more around like why you might feel guilty around person. This person might have a way of living that clashes with yours, and there might be an energy or a stated kind of feeling of judgment that comes from them. If you ever have the feeling of like certain people you get nervous or you shrink around, they can be somebody who gives you the feeling of like not being good enough, feeling like you're not a right person, or they might remind you of someone who does that. So there's a lot to say there, but just in short, I'm going to say that, but I think more will unfold from our presentation. So those are kind of the basic overarching definitions and the differences. And we're going to talk about both kind of in tandem in a lot of ways throughout the presentation. I am going to say that shame does have a heavier weight in the sense of it being your sense of yourself. So why do this presentation? So I'm hoping all of you are here because this topic called you in some way, and I'd love for you to share, if you'd like to, why this is important to you. I'm already hearing a lot of reasons that are, it's painful to hear, and I totally get it, like living with shame every day, like if you're aware of that, right? And so welcome to BetterHelp. That's exciting. So why talk about it? So I wrote this, talking about guilt and shame can be a remedy in itself. So us sitting here in this group talking about it, because guilt and shame, if you can imagine, have a way of silencing us. They have a way of literally silencing us, making us hide, making us cower in our truths, all of these kinds of things. So I think just the act of talking about it can be a remedy in itself, being able to talk about it, share it with people who can understand it, and start, accepting who you are, which is the space we want to create here, is a space where this invites you to be yourself. So more about why talking about guilt and shame. I shared a little bit about my personal interest in working with guilt and shame. So it just showed up in everyone I work with. And then I realized as I was, working in the field of counseling, and a big portion of my work early on was with people living with HIV and AIDS. And it was at the Colorado AIDS Project in Denver. And it was a population of mostly men who identified as gay men who were in their 60s plus. So you could imagine, talk about a stigmatized population here when, dealing with being not only gay, but being HIV positive, in the 80s. It was like when they were young, and, all of those movements started happening, and talk about being a stigmatized population. So I ended up, in our process of working together with a lot of the clients I worked with there, noticed the experience of guilt and shame, and really how pervasive it was in a whole community. And it was so painful to see that. And so that, like how much it showed up, and it got to a point where I was like, oh, I got to do like a shame curriculum. So I had created like a 9-week group about shame and made these little workbooks for people to work on. So it just showed up as so important in that work. And then it also showed up in my personal life. So I identify as what I'd call like a first generation born and raised in America. My parents are from Bangladesh. And so I work a lot with people who also identify as first generation and have parents from other cultures. And when you're dealing with cultural differences and living in America and being raised where there's two different cultures, there's a different kind of experience of guilt and shame that some people can have based on the expectations of the culture. And if you're not fulfilling them, bringing a sense of shame on the family. So that's an area that's very kind of close to my heart, and I do a lot of work on with people, if it rings true for them. So transference with therapist. I'm trying to read people's stuff here and there. Yeah, if you're experiencing guilt or shame directly with the therapist, it sounds like you already have a lot of awareness around that, like what it might be to kind of open up and talk about it. You also want to see what's kind of creating that environment of guilt and shame for you, which we'll talk about later, and see if that can be chipped away at. So when we talk about guilt and shame and the importance of it, I was sharing a little bit about my experience with people living with HIV in Colorado. And I also have worked with people who had been imprisoned, and were on parole. Also, a lot of work with people who have dealt with addictions. And my gosh, so much guilt and shame. And so I mentioned the impact of guilt and shame at every level of our society in that second bullet here, because I want us to really think about how prevalent guilt and shame are from society all the way to the level of law. So you have people experiencing extreme shame for being addicts, for example, when so many of the addicts I worked with, right, were initially prescribed some kind of medication they got addicted to by a doctor, right? And then it becomes a problem, and then they become this person that's ousted from society in a lot of ways. And also, oftentimes, they are put in prison. So I worked with a lot of people who were in jail, and instead of getting the right treatment and what they needed to do to progress in life and getting the, and finding the right treatment for addiction is also very challenging. They would be put in jail, which is like another layer of stigma. And and these things sit literally in your records, right? So these things can be shown to employers and things like that. So think about things like that. How we do have societal morals, and those of you who live in different countries, I'm sure, have different ways of relating to this. So I apologize. I'm speaking only to probably things I've seen in America here. But hopefully this still rings true for you, of like how, yeah, the law and family courts and how they perpetuate shame, like so many things that are like painful experiences people go through where they're put in jail for them. Shame in society can also look like, literally, you'll hear things in the news, right? Really subtle things that paint people in a bad light, right? Race is a big one here. So we can go on and on about this, but I want us to all to like, my hope is that you can start opening your ears to like how present guilting and shaming is all over, even in things that on the surface look right. So one of the things I shared is that it was so crazy because where I went to graduate school was a school that was focused on really trying to bring in diversity, right? And understanding aspects of diversity, had really good intentions, right? Also bringing in a spiritual focus. However, the school was located in an environment that was very privileged, very like predominantly white. And yeah, and a lot of people who didn't come from backgrounds or live in places really where you had struggle or various cultures. So there was this kind of really weird dynamic going on there, and there was a lot from this place of privilege. You look in a lot of privileged communities too, there's also a lot of focus on like health and well-being, which on the surface looks really good, right? But what would happen is that there was an energy of shame, body shame, that was created because it was this healthy yoga community where everyone was privileged and most people were white. And there was a certain way that a body should look and a certain way people should eat. And literally people felt shame if they wanted to like have fast food for a day. And so it was really interesting, but that opened my eyes to the fact that guilting and shaming can happen even when on the surface a society, community, culture has good intentions, right? So body shaming is a huge one. If you're in a community of like body health yoga, things like that, the hope is that it's very much like respectful of like all shapes and sizes. But then I think especially most women know that there's this kind of like image of like this yoga body, right? And what you look like in the yoga pants that's out there. So that is shame that's created from the foundation of what's supposed to be health. So really start to look at and question in a way that feels, healthy for you, where guilt and shame might be present, because sometimes it's hidden. The other place is, of course, my hope is that you can look at the influence of guilt and shame in your personal journey. So a lot of people have already here been sharing kind of why it's important to you to address guilt and shame. And I would say that if you're taking notes here, write that down for yourself too. It's going to be, we're going to talk about this later, part of your motivation of getting to work on it. So why is it important to you to address guilt and shame? So definitely continue to share that with your peers here in the chat. And what I want to say, in our last group webinar, I think it was a really powerful experience that came up. Someone was sharing stuff, I believe, about their faith in the corner. I was just kind of seeing some things pop up around faith. And even the chat itself, there was a little bit of contention because there was a feeling of like, oh, is this person preaching? Da, 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 da. So I think it's so important to name this. You might have a picture of shame that was heavily put on you from something in the way you were raised with a religion or spirituality. However, someone else might have the total opposite. They might have the experience of like that their spirituality or religion was what helped them heal their shame. So it's not the thing, it's not the label that causes shame per se. It's more about what was it that was filtered down to you from maybe this label in a way that was shaming. So we want this to be a safe space. And this came up in the last group, and I thought it was such a powerful thing to name, is that you might hear people's experiences from all walks of life here. And we want to always be careful about like judging, like, okay, this thing, religion, whatever, might be shaming, but that's not it. It's the experience and how it was transmitted to people. So that's what we're going to look at when we talk about the development of guilt and shame in your life, is how was it transmitted? Same with, I shared a little bit about like my cultural background. So I had to look at, unique to myself, what are the things that were present in my culture that were creating shame for me? And what were the things that were really beautiful? And my experience of that, based on who I am and where those things rubbed up against me wrong, it's going to be very different from somebody else. So I love that there's some words of positivity going on here for each other. There's probably some really difficult experiences being shared there that I'm missing, but I'm going to go back and read them in the recording. So let's look at this. I'm really excited about this slide. This is where we're going to open up a little bit of the holistic perspective here. So we can probably have a whole grouping on what like holistic means. And so I'm going to just give a very kind of straightforward way of talking about it right now, but feel free, do some research on holistic health, alternative health, psycho-spiritual stuff, right? To get a better picture of this for yourself. But all I'm going to say, for the sake of getting enough information about this for this group, is that the idea holistic means that we look at a person as a whole being. It's in the word holistic. You're a whole being. So we're not just these little parts. And especially from what I know in our Western society, there's a lot of the treatment of people that looks at us in little parts, right? So all the way down to medicine, right? You have a kidney issue, we're going to treat the kidney. However, when you think about holistic practices, acupuncture is one of them, and it's connected to EFT, which I mentioned earlier. They look at the human as this whole complex system, right? And so someone's kidney issues can be connected very scientifically, actually, in their traditions, to emotional patterns, other things in the body, right? So that's one example. But if we look at holistic from maybe a more spiritual perspective, it's looking at you like you're this whole beautiful spirit, soul, whatever you relate to. You're this amazing being. And if we try and break you up into little pieces, like your depression, the mental patterns that create your depression, and you define yourself in that way, we're missing a lot. We're also missing a lot of things and complicated dynamics that can create the depression. So holistic is about looking at you as a whole being and looking at the interconnectedness of various things and treating you as such. So when we look at guilt and shame from a holistic perspective, we're going to look at it as experiences that can land on us mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, sit on us in different ways. So these images here are going to start to address that. And I love using imagery and metaphors in counseling sessions with people because it starts um, tapping at um, tapping into, sorry, that holistic thing. So when we can see metaphors or pictures, it gives us insight into something bigger working within us. So if you look at that EFT handout I gave when I try and teach people about EFT and the emotional body, I talk about that emotional body being like a river that flows inside of us. So when you can start using metaphors around your experiences, including around shame and guilt, it can help you start opening your ears, your senses more to like, what else can that be and how else is this sitting with me, so I can treat it as such, because it's not just a mental thing. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So let's look at these pictures here to try and understand guilt and shame a little bit better. Can shame be a cause of daily drained energy? Yes. I love that you asked that. Yes, 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 yes. So I'm going to say I do believe that in everything we deal with in especially like psychology. So there's these, diagnoses we have in our field, depression, things like that, that often come with fatigue. Even if you just have physical fatigue, a lot of times there is that mental piece attached to it that maybe hasn't been uncovered. In short, I'm going to say that if you look at things like depression, addictions, anxiety, there's almost always going to be some quality of shame in there. I'm just going to like say that there almost always is. And let's actually, that question, we'll start with the picture here on the lower left, which is an image of somebody sitting in this posture, right? In like a hole. And so when I think about the experience of guilt and shame, one of the things that comes up and that I've heard from people I've worked with is that it can be very like an isolating experience, right? And it can make you like just kind of want to crawl into a hole, literally. And it can feel like you're in a cave, like hiding in darkness. And when you're like this for so long, and I do this, so talking about the physical way shame and guilt hold us, it literally holds you down, makes you shrink. That word shrink always stands out to me. Hopefully this kind of makes sense to some of you here, where it's like you're in a setting of some sort and you don't even realize it, but shame somewhere has kicked in. You don't feel good in your skin or about who you are in a certain environment, setting, or situation, and you literally shrink in yourself. That's what happens. So if you imagine, oh yes, yes, thank you. I'm glad I read that. Yes, describe the picture. So this first image I'm talking about, thank you so much for naming that. This first picture I'm talking about is an image of a person sitting down with their knees up. It looks like their hands are on their face and their hand is down, and the image is a shadow, and the person is sitting in what looks like almost like a dark tunnel, and there's a little bit of a hole with light coming out of it. So it very much looks like a person crouching with their head down in a cave. And so if you think about this, going back to the question someone asked about feeling tired, imagine feeling like this all the time, right? So someone mentioned, I feel shame all the time. In essence, you're kind of shrinking and hiding, living with some kind of fear about who you are, feeling like there's always judgment coming at you. As you can imagine, that is exhausting. You're literally like not breathing, right? That's like the way I could think about it, suffocating. So cave dweller here. Yeah, so I do think that shame can literally create exhaustion and be a huge threat in things like depression, anxiety, things like that. And hopefully the more we talk about it, the more it'll make sense. So the next image, let's actually go to the one right above that. And this is an image, and please do type anyone here if my description doesn't fit. I'm going to try and describe these pictures well for one of our participants here, and feel free to type more if you think I need to do a better job describing these. So yeah, so it's a picture where there's this figure, right? It's like an outline of a being, and his head looks a little bit down. This one's kind of like a retro cartoony, but anyhow, his head's a little bit down, and there are these pictures of these huge hands, so they're bigger than the person, actually pointing at him from the outside. So it's a very small being with like human size hands pointing at him, like when people point your pointer finger and tell you that you're wrong. about something. So this image I love because it talks about how guilt and shame come with the experience of people always judging you. There's like this invisible, I mentioned it before, external judge. Like shame and guilt come with this external judge, right? Which we're going to talk about how that develops, that is telling us that what we're doing is wrong. We're not doing enough. You're not good enough. You're not this enough. You're not doing this right. Do this better. All these voices and pointing at us, blaming us for like not being right. So I think that really gets at a lot of the elements of judgment, expectations from others, morals of right and wrong that are projected onto you that come with guilt and shame. So let's go to the picture. Actually, I'm going to come to the middle one last, I think. So if we go to the top right one, this is an image of a figure who is crouched over because she has what looks like a giant cube maybe on her. It's just the corner of it, but it basically looks like she's holding this massive weight that is way bigger than what she can handle. Would you guys say? It looks like a weight that she should not be carrying. So I cannot say how many times I hear in working with people this metaphor, and I think it's more than a metaphor. I think it's a literal feeling. Again, this can cause exhaustion and fatigue of carrying things, feeling a burden of some sort, the weight of the world on your shoulders, maybe the weight of a situation on your shoulders, right? Some kind of weight. Now, how does this connect with guilt and shame? I think it goes back to the last picture we described. Oh, it does. I didn't think about that. It kind of can look like she's on the edge of a cliff too, someone wrote. So yeah, so it kind of goes back, I think, to the other picture of these like expectations, who you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to be doing, how you're supposed to be living your life, right? These things weighing on you. They feel like a weight when it's in contradiction with how you want to live. So all of these things feel like a weight if something is not your truth, right? And you feel like you have to live it. And if you don't, there's going to be consequences. They sit on you like a weight. That's the thing. Versus if we're living free of guilt and shame in our truth, we feel free. So the reason why guilt and shame cause weight, it's exactly that. Whatever you're holding on to, whatever's being put on you, doesn't match what you want to do to live. So that's a good question. Someone asked, are all the pictures of females? Honestly, I wasn't tracking that when I chose these pictures, and some of them it's hard to tell. Like the lower left, I couldn't tell if that's a female. The top one, we can kind of think it's a male, but not. Maybe I chose them consciously like that because, yeah, I'm not sure. I didn't want to be like too gender specific in this definition, but yeah, good question. The bottom right one, does look. Yeah, they're more cartoons. Thank you for saying that. I was trying to figure out how to describe what they are. These are all cartoons. I think the bottom left one is maybe a picture, but then it was adjusted with, I forgot what it's called, technology. Anyhow, so the bottom right one, let's go to that one. It's an image, again, and this is a drawing as well. These are all drawings or cartoons of someone who's looking back. What looks like is almost like an abstract forest. So I chose this image because it reminds me of how like guilt and shame are like these things that follow us. They like follow us and we're always looking out for them. Like we're always looking at as like, okay, should I be doing this? Should, right? The should keeps coming up. And then the feeling is that you're always being monitored. I use this phrase a lot with people I work with where there's an anxiety or something that comes up immediately. Maybe it's every day, all the time. Maybe it's in certain settings, but it's a feeling that you've got eyes on you. I know that's a little creepy, but I don't know why I love that phrase. It's walking around with the feeling that you literally have eyes on you. That happens for a lot of us because we really are watched and judged so much in our life. Maybe in your home, you're constantly watched and judged and criticized. So that's the idea of having pressure to perform, someone wrote, the idea of eyes on you all the time. So I hope that didn't sound crazy. Hopefully that made sense. Maybe another way of putting it that's like not so creepy is like the idea of being watched all the time, and having these judgments follow you. So people are talking about candles here, which is great. I wish I kind of saw where that started. I'm a big user of candles. I saw someone talk about using electric ones and that they're much more safe too. The other thing is, if you like candles, is you put them in a bowl of water, and it's like a nice way of preventing fires. So I'm guessing candles came up talking about being in darkness. Um, so the middle picture there, let's go to this. If you can, let's see, someone else, can I view previous slides while watching the seminar? I don't think so. If someone else knows a different answer to that, honestly, I'm kind of new to this. I'm so sorry. But you should have a copy of the slides attached to your email that you got for this event. Also, I attached them to the very first thing on this chat thread. So hopefully you can pull them out in another window if you can't access them here. If you could, I'm going to say they're going to show on the side for you and you can click back, but I'm going to guess that you can't. So let's see, the middle picture. I love this one. So the image in the middle here looks like a little girl cartoon, and she's standing, and there is her shadow, and what her shadow is, and her shadow is like maybe 5 times her size, and it's the shadow of like a monster is what it looks like. So I love this picture because when I really get in and work with guilt and shame with people, we realize and start identifying it almost like it's its own being. So it's kind of like guilt and shame have become like a buddy that kind of like walks with you. And I call it your shame body. So it's this being, and a lot of people, I think there's actually a group that was going on, I don't know if it still is, about your inner critic. And I think the shame body can really mimic the inner critic. It might be the same for some people, it might be different. I think that involves the inner critic, but I think it's more too. And so I call it the shame being, right? And it's like when we first get to work on it, is to start looking at it as a being, helps us start understanding that it's like this thing that took shape in our lives, developed very much like a human develops, right? And became attached to you. And the reason why it became attached to you is going to be really important here. And I'm going to talk about it in this next slide here. So, play with those images as you will. Those were really just things that came up from the top of my mind. But I hope that opens your mind a little bit to like how these guilt and shame sit on you, very much like energies or like a presence, right? So it's not just like a word. That's what I wanted to kind of emphasize here. So in terms of development and talking about it like a being, I'm going to go into the development of it. And the first thing I'm going to name here is related to this piece of like, this being, shame, guilt, became attached to you for a reason. So this is so important. If you could take one thing away from this groupinar, I'm going to say it's this, and it's not on the slides, which is you adopted guilt and shame at some level out of a need for survival. So that's why it's so strongly attached to us, right? There comes a certain point in adulthood where you start slowly realizing that you can let go of some of these things and you're going to be okay, right? That if you feel shame around a certain part of yourself, maybe you find the community that fits you and you realize you're like, okay, that's okay. But there's a reason why certain parts of us that feel shame literally feel fear at the level of like threat, like you're being threatened. So the reason for this, and the reason why our shame beings become our buddies, is from a place of survival. So what happens is that when you're born all the way through adulthood, which people define differently, but there's some formative years that go until the age of 7. There's other cultures that look at it as 15, 18, 21, but whatever it is, I'm going to say into adulthood, formative years. The task of development at each age is really dependent, like life and death dependent on those who raise you. So parent figures, whatever, whoever's in your environment raising you, that's where you learn to be a human. That's where you learn to be safe in the world. That's what you have. So when you're born, like literally, you think about it, you have to be fed, right? When baby cries, ideally, baby is either held, fed, moved around, right? So you have these needs, and a human has to meet those needs. If a human doesn't meet those needs for you, you literally won't feel like you can survive. So your sense of attachment, people talk about attachment issues all the time for a reason. You have a need to attach to people when you're young. You have to. to learn, you have to have that reflection of people around you. So imagine then if you have learned ways to be from these people, guilt and shame from these people, you had no choice but to kind of adopt to them so that they would stay in your life. So it literally felt like survival. At some point, it wasn't survival, but it still felt like that in your nervous system. Does that make sense? Walking on eggshells. I use that phrase all the time. Yeah. So shame and guilt, that's why they're so hard to shake. There comes a point in our life that not many people talk about, recognize, or find the right teachers or guides for. And if you couldn't attach, then there's all a swirl of other, like maybe woundings that can come from that. But there's also probably ways that you freed yourself from that. That's a really good complex question. I'm not sure I could fully just explain it without thinking about it, to be honest. But attachment stuff, not getting, I'm glad this resonates. Not being attached becomes part of that too. When you think about it, let's say you're guilted. Let's say somebody has a parent figure that is really kind of yelling all the time and disciplinary. You're not going to have that level of healthy attachment. You won't attach. However, that fear will still be transmitted to you because you have to live in that home for survival, if that makes sense. So someone mentioned that's how kids feel around me, unfortunately. Thanks for naming that. If you're noticing this about yourself, and this is a beautiful thing to recognize, if you carry guilt and shame, you, without realizing, are very likely, and don't be hard on yourself for this, projecting it onto other people around you. And I have a I have a 7-month-old, and I've dedicated myself to digging at any of my remaining guilt and shame because I do not want to tell him how he should be. And it's really hard not to do that because it sometimes comes from a place of protection. So if you notice this, if you're a parent or maybe in a relationship, if you notice that you find yourself guilting or shaming other people, come right back to your own experience of guilt and shame and work on it because it gets passed down. That's just what happens, or it comes out of you. So go right back to your healing, your own healing. So anyhow, so going back to kind of how this stuff is adopted and developed. If you go back to this idea of like you had no choice but to take some of these things on and accept them as your norm. So if I don't act this way, if I don't be this in my career, if I don't be this kind of woman, if I'm not quiet or polite enough, whatever, right? Whatever it is, then if I don't look a certain way, right? Then guilt and shame develop from there. These things, where it develops, I put this on the left here. It says there's this concept in Gestalt psychology. If anyone's heard of Gestalt, it's a really cool type of psychology that's really looks at the person as a whole and works from there. But they have this word that they use called interjects. And what an interject is in Gestalt psychology is that they're ideas of the right way to be that in essence, they say you swallowed whole. So they're ideas of what's right and wrong, what you should be like as a person, right? How you should treat people, how you should act, what your career should be. The list can go on and on and on, right? What makes you a good person that you literally, like, you swallowed whole. This is it. You took it in and it becomes your norm. So I love that description of it being something you swallowed whole, because that describes this next thing here, this bullet, which is a lot of times, and I'm going to say most of the time, experiences that relate to guilt and shame can be indirect as well as direct. They can be verbal or nonverbal, conscious or unconscious. So I had this experience, for example, and I'm wondering if any of you have as well, right? Where it's like born into the family. I was raised with the culture a lot, in a lot of settings where there were people of the same culture. No one talked about it, but it was kind of known what we do and don't do. It was known. And if we did these certain things, then we knew it would bring shame to the family. It's not like the family said it directly. It was just known. So it was really unconscious. Verbal, nonverbal, a very direct example of that is like when you're literally told shame on you, right? That's a verbal way shame can be transmitted. So often, though, it's really nonverbal. Maybe it's the way someone looks at you. Maybe it's other things they say. Maybe it's gossip about you, right? So, yeah. So hopefully that makes sense. And I want to really open your minds to kind of the subtle, invisible ways guilt and shame develop so that you can start uncovering them for yourself. And we'll give a little bit more examples of that. So, so cultural influences, I shared a little bit about. I'm being mindful of time and I really want to get to the tools next. So I'm going to go through this more quickly than I'd want to. But my hope is that I've told some people in the last group in ours, hopefully I could do a round two, like a part two of this group, and then get more into these things. So sorry, I'm going to go through this part a little fast, but cultural influences, I really wanted to name a part of like culture and diversity that stands out so much in shame and guilt, especially in our society at least, is around gender and sexuality. I know there's been some people sharing stories there. It's crazy. I don't even want to get into this because I'll start getting like really fired up about it, right? But if you've been a victim of any kind of sexual assault, for example, it's always the case that you walk out of it with shame. It's crazy, right? Like, why? It's so crazy. So, for whatever reason, throughout history, there's been a lot of guilt and shame around sex, sexual practices, right? Gender identity, and what you look like. So, there's theories about where a lot of this started, right? If it was like some of the origins of like, okay, survival, sex is for procreation, this kind of stuff. But it's beyond that. There's something else. There's more to it that I think people don't realize because of how deeply rooted it is. So when we talk about how harmful guilt and shame can be, again, I worked a lot with people in the LGBTQIA community, for example. And I mean, we know this, right? At least in America, of like how high suicide rates are. That is the effect of shame and guilt around that population, right? Really harmful. So really wanted to name gender and sexuality there. So religious and spiritual influences are places where guilt and shame can develop. Again, I want to be really mindful in saying these things. These things can be really safe, happy, positive things for people. But what we're talking about here are areas to look at if in fact the guilt and shame developed for you in these places. So I do work with a lot of people who they were maybe taught some way of being that was right and wrong in their religion, but it didn't fit with them. So virtual hugs, love it. Family dynamics and norms, we talked about that. That's going to be like a really good go-to place to work on. So if you want a little practice here to start looking at how guilt and shame developed in your life, start looking at what were the norms that were like taught to you in your family. That's like such a good way to go in your family of upbringing. What were you told and what was unspoken, and what felt right or wrong? Where did you find yourself shrinking and why, right? And you could also be someone who maybe had that obvious kind of experience, maybe a really disciplinary parent, maybe you were really directly told what was right and wrong. So looking at those and how are those sitting on you and still creating fear. Societal norms, we talked about that, including at the level of law. This one's a cool one, right? We literally have laws that technically are trying to show what's right and wrong, right? So looking at that, those can be places where guilt and shame develop. And then this is where I wanted to mention trauma, your direct experiences that shape your role, self-identity, self-concept, including traumatic events, are going to be sources of guilt and shame. When you go to work on trauma, you will find guilt and shame in there. It's going to come with trauma. And I'll talk more about that maybe in a part 2 group in R. Maybe I'll focus on the trauma and effects of guilt and shame in it because it's going to be there. Keywords I listed here. So these are like almost like red flags for when there might be guilt and shame hanging out. Think of the word expectations, judgments, stigma, and morals. So these are good kind of keywords to look at if you felt these things. So moving along, how to start working on your experience of guilt and shame. So I'm hoping you guys have copies of the slides because I know we only have 5 minutes here. Let's see. So 1, set your intention. So this is so important. So we're short on time, but I'm going to spend time on this one and I'm going to blow through the rest because if I were to give you guys an assignment to take out of this, it would be just start here. Set your intention. What is your motivation to let your guilt or shame go? So you might have a direct goal, right? I want to be this for my career, but maybe it's not aligned with what you were taught is okay. Maybe it's something big. I want to be my free and wild self, right? Set that motivation. Set your intention about why you want to let it go. That's going to give you permission to start letting it go and own it. So take your time with that intention and own it in your life. I'm going to be this person because this is what I deserve to be. This is my free self. This is the expression of my truth. And own that intention because you deserve it. So really spend your time there. And then I mentioned start the process of observing the workings of shame and guilt within you and your immediate environment. So start looking at, we talked about how they develop and how they work a little bit. Start seeing if you can track that. I gave the example of like, where is it that you start shrinking and feeling fear? Start tracking that. Start noticing. Notice who triggers it, right? And then this piece here, because I'm going to say that kind of cracking down your guilt and shame can be like, in a way, a lifelong process. Because if you think about it, let's say there's a hope of evolving more and more and more into the truth of who you are. If you think about it that way, letting go of shame is going to be an ongoing process. So it's not a process to be rushed. And I promise you, as you get to work on it, things feel better and better and better. And actually, the process itself can be a little addictive and feel good. So don't rush the process. And so instead, what I wanted to name here is to explore some barriers to like why it's so hard to get rid of the guilt and shame and just validate them. So going back to that development thing I mentioned, is like we formed these things for a reason. It made us feel safe to fit in with our families, to fit in with other people. So realize, I love that, upgrading yourself like a phone. So just realize when you're feeling how heavy it is and that it's hard to push through, just validate yourself that it's okay. These things can take time and they're hard for a reason. So I just threw this question out there. So if you're doing any journaling for yourself, what are some steps you can take to break through some of the shame or guilt that holds you back? And these last slides here, in these last couple minutes I have, I'll give you some examples of areas to look at where you can kind of dissect this question for yourself. Body awareness. I love this one, being someone who's experienced a lot of healing from body-based practices like dance, myself. Notice how shame and guilt are held in your body. I talked about that image of feeling contracted and shrunk in who you are. You'd be surprised. There are subtle shifts you can make in how your experience of guilt and shame is held in your body. An example is that if you find yourself like slouching your shoulders, you can even get to work on that. I mean, for months, you can work on walking around with your shoulders rolled back, your heart open, this is like something we're taught in dance a lot. And you literally start feeling like the energy in your heart freeing up. And that energy is going to contradict the energy of shame, which keeps your heart closed. That's an example. Posture. Mental and emotional healing. I just made a note that is probably best as a guided process. Many of you are connected to therapists here. Take your experience of shame and guilt into therapy if you can. And like I mentioned, because it's going to probably involve a little bit of trauma release, it's just nice to have this process guided. Someone who can help you bounce off kind of your ideas of where guilt and shame developed and help you really work through them. So changing the thought patterns and emotional patterns is the way I worded it, that keep you connected to your guilt and shame. What you're going to find is there's beliefs about who you are. I also briefly wanted to mention spirituality. This has been a big space for myself to kind of heal guilt and shame. And for me, the only thing I wanted to say here, because this is such a unique personal experience, spirituality for everyone, is that to me, spirituality is the idea that there's something greater that can see the truth of who we are. There's this great force, call it what you will for yourself, nature, whatever, that isn't judged, that wants us to be free. And we ourselves can't always see that about ourselves. So there's this greater force that knows the spirit that you are and wants you to be it. It's your birthright. And so for me, connecting to spirituality is a gateway for me to kind of surprise myself. Oh, this is my truth, and kind of break the shame. So spirituality is being able to have that perspective that's greater than just the human mind. So I mentioned some environmental shifts. I know we're at time here, and briefly, just kind of, you can look over this in your own time, examining relationships, home, culture. What are the things that support your freedom, your authentic self, and what aren't? Start looking at what are steps you can make to start being in environments that support you better. It's not an easy one for some people. I'm not saying like leave your, relationship if it's bringing you shame. Yes, I have heard of Alan Watts. It's a hard thing, but just start looking at it. And realize that now that you're an adult, you can shift these things, right? It might feel like your core is being shaken, but now you have the freedom as an adult to shift these things for the most part. Some people don't. And if you do, you can set your intention and work on it. So moving towards environments that support your freedom and authenticity. So even if you're stuck in a really toxic environment, can you find the littlest thing, one person to go to who supports you and who you are? So thank you guys so much. I'm so sorry I had to rush here at the end. I never can predict what happens every week. You're welcome to come to this group and as often as you like. Every time I'm going to say it's a little bit different, depending on some questions that come up and things like that. But thank you all so much for joining me. I am going to go back and read, what I missed in the recording, because I really appreciate, I know some of you shared so many really personal things. So just a lot of love to you all for that. My big intention here is that you get to live your truth, and you deserve it, and you can fight for it. So hopefully I'll see you all in future group webinars. Thank you so much. Take care.